The engine screamed like it was dying in front of everyone. Inside Caldwell Racing's glass-walled garage in California, a $1 million prototype sat frozen just minutes before its most important test run, and 20 of the best engineers in the industry stood around it silent, confused, exposed. Ava Caldwell, the CEO known for firing people faster than problems, stared at the dashboard with cold fury as sponsors watched from above their investments hanging by a thread. "Why is it not responding?" She snapped, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, but no one answered because no one knew. Then, from the far corner of the garage, a man in a worn maintenance uniform slowly stepped forward, wiping grease from his hands like he didn't belong in the moment at all. His name was Ethan Cole, a single father no one really noticed, just the quiet guy who fixed broken tools and cleaned up after everyone else. "It's not the fuel system," he said calmly, almost too quietly to matter, but the room turned anyway, annoyed, dismissive. One of the senior engineers laughed under his breath. "Stay in your lane, man." But Ethan didn't argue. He just walked closer, eyes locked on the engine like he was listening to something no one else could hear. "You're solving the wrong problem," he added, and before anyone could stop him, his hand reached into the machine, adjusting something so small it looked meaningless. Security moved. Ava's expression darkened. "Don't touch that," she barked, but it was too late. The engine roared back to life, smooth, perfect, as if it had never failed at all. The entire garage fell into stunned silence. For half a second, it felt like a miracle. Then Ava's face hardened. "Who gave you permission?" she demanded, her voice colder now, sharper. Ethan stepped back. Not proud, not defensive, just quiet. "I was helping," he said. "That was enough." "You're fired," she replied, instantly turning to security. "Remove him, now." Gasps rippled through the room as two guards escorted him out like a criminal past the same engineers who had just watched him do what none of them could. And standing near the exit, clutching a small backpack, his 7-year-old daughter Lily watched it all unfold, her eyes wide, confused, searching her father's face for an answer he didn't give. Ethan didn't look back. He didn't explain. He just walked out in silence. Behind him, the engine continued to hum perfectly. And somewhere in the room, one young engineer whispered under his breath, "Wait." How did he know that? Ethan Cole didn't resist when the guards took his arm, even though their grip was unnecessarily tight, as if they were afraid he might try something reckless after what had just happened. But he didn't fight because fighting would have required him to explain. And explaining had never been something he chose to do anymore, not here, not in a place that had long stopped listening to him. So he simply walked steady and silent past the stunned engineers who avoided his eyes, past the polished floors that reflected his worn boots, like a reminder that he didn't belong, and past the glass wall where the sponsors stood whispering to each other, their confusion quickly turning into disapproval because in their eyes, what they had just witnessed wasn't a miracle, it was a breach. A violation of hierarchy, a dangerous moment where a nobody had stepped out of line and touched something he had no right to touch. And in a company like Caldwell Racing, where every role was strictly defined and every authority carefully guarded, that was unforgivable, no matter the result, no matter the outcome, no matter that the engine was now running smoother than it had all week. Because rules mattered more than results, when those rules protected power. And Ava Caldwell embodied that power as she stood there with her arms crossed. Her expression unreadable, but her decision absolute, already turning away from the scene as if Ethan had ceased to exist the moment the word "fired" left her lips. Already instructing her assistant to review security protocols and restrict access levels. Already rewriting the narrative in her mind, so that what had happened wasn't a failure of her engineers, but an intrusion by someone beneath them. Someone who had disrupted the order she had built so carefully over the years. And as the heavy door to the garage opened and the outside air rushed in, Ethan stepped through without a word, the sunlight hitting his face in stark contrast to the cold fluorescent lights behind him. And there, just a few feet away, stood Lily, small and still, her fingers gripping the strap of her faded backpack, her eyes searching his face for answers he wasn't ready to give, because how could he explain something like this to a 7-year-old? How could he tell her that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't matter if the wrong people are watching? How could he teach her that truth doesn't always win in the moment? So instead, he knelt down in front of her, ignoring the guards who lingered awkwardly behind him, and he gave her the same soft smile he always did, the one that made everything feel okay, even when it wasn't. And he said quietly, "Hey, kiddo," as if this was just another normal afternoon, and not the moment everything had just changed, and Lily hesitated before speaking. Her voice small but steady as she asked, "Did you break something?" And that question, simple and innocent, cut deeper than anything Ava had said inside that garage, because it reflected exactly what everyone else believed now. That he had done something wrong, that he had crossed a line he shouldn't have crossed, that he had caused trouble instead of solving it. And for a brief second, Ethan considered telling her the truth, considered explaining the complexity of what had happened, the sound he had heard in the engine that no one else had recognized, the imbalance in the system that had been overlooked by experts, too focused on data instead of instinct. But he stopped himself, because Lily didn't need that kind of explanation, not yet. So he simply shook his head gently and said, "No, sweetheart. I didn't break anything," and she studied him for a moment longer as if weighing his words before nodding slowly, choosing to believe him the way only a child can, completely and without doubt. And that trust, that quiet faith in him was both a comfort and a burden, because it meant he had to carry everything else alone. And as they walked away from the building together hand in hand, the massive Caldwell Racing logo towering above them, like a symbol of everything he was leaving behind. Neither of them looked back. But inside the garage, the atmosphere had shifted in a way no one could quite explain. Because despite Ava's decisive reaction, despite the quick return to protocol and control, there was something unsettled lingering in the air, something that couldn't be ignored, and it started with the engineers who had witnessed something they couldn't easily dismiss. Because they had seen the engine fail, they had tried and failed to fix it themselves, and then they had seen a maintenance worker step in and solve the problem in seconds, and no amount of authority or hierarchy could erase that reality from their minds. So whispers began quiet at first, but growing as the minutes passed, questions without answers, doubts without resolution. And one of the younger engineers, a recent hire named Daniel Brooks, found himself replaying the moment over and over in his head, the way Ethan had moved, the confidence in his voice, the precision of his adjustment. None of it matched the profile of a janitor, none of it made sense, and yet it had happened right in front of him. And as he stood there staring at the now perfectly running engine, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, a mix of curiosity and unease, because if Ethan had been right, if he had known something they didn't, then what did that say about all of them? About their expertise, about their authority? And before he could stop himself, Daniel spoke up, his voice tentative but clear as he said, "We should at least review what he did." And the room fell silent again, not out of shock this time, but out of discomfort, because acknowledging Ethan's contribution meant questioning Ava's decision, and questioning Ava was not something anyone did lightly, not in this company, not in this environment. So the senior engineer, Mark Reynolds, quickly dismissed the suggestion with a shake of his head, saying, "It was a coincidence. Nothing more." The issue was already stabilizing, even though he knew that wasn't true, even though everyone in the room knew it wasn't true. But admitting otherwise would have meant admitting failure, and failure was not an option they could afford, especially not now. Not with the upcoming race, not with the pressure mounting from every direction, so the narrative was set. Unspoken but understood. Ethan had overstepped. Ethan had interfered. Ethan had been removed, and the problem had been solved by the team, because that was the version of events that preserved order, that maintained control, that kept everything from unraveling, and Ava, standing in her office overlooking the garage, watched the activity below with a calm exterior that hid the storm beneath. Because despite her certainty in the moment, despite her unwavering confidence in her decision, there was a small, persistent doubt that refused to be silenced, a question that lingered at the edge of her thoughts. One she couldn't quite articulate but couldn't ignore either, and it was rooted in something simple, something undeniable. The fact that the engine had come back to life the moment Ethan touched it, and no amount of authority could change that. No amount of discipline could rewrite that moment. And as she turned away from the window trying to focus on the tasks ahead, she found herself wondering just for a second who exactly Ethan Cole really was. But she pushed the thought aside almost immediately, because in her world, uncertainty was weakness, and weakness was not something she allowed herself to feel. So she moved forward, doubling down on control, reinforcing the rules, tightening the structure, unaware that the very thing she had just cast out might be the key to everything she was about to lose, and somewhere far from the polished floors and high-stakes decisions. Ethan sat on the edge of his small apartment bed later that evening, watching Lily as she colored at the kitchen table, her world untouched by the events of the day, her laughter soft and genuine, as she showed him her drawing of a race car with bright colors and crooked lines, and he smiled. Truly smiled this time, because in that moment, none of the rest of it mattered. Not the job, not the humiliation, not the judgment. But even as he reached for the drawing, his eyes lingered on the details she had added. The shape of the car, the proportions of the engine, small things that mirrored reality more closely than a child her age should understand. And he wondered, not for the first time, how much she saw, how much she understood, and whether one day he would have to tell her the truth about everything, about who he had been, about what he had built, about why he had walked away. But for now he stayed silent, just as he had in that garage, just as he always did, letting the world believe whatever it wanted, even if that meant letting them believe he was the man who made a mistake. Because sometimes the cost of being understood was higher than the cost of being judged, and Ethan had already paid that price once before. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty. The kind of quiet that wrapped itself around small lives built carefully after loss. And Ethan Cole moved through it with the same steady rhythm he carried everywhere else, as if every motion had already been decided long before the day began. As if control over the little things was the only way to survive the ones he couldn't control at all. And Lily sat cross-legged on the worn rug near the coffee table, her crayons scattered like bright fragments of a world far simpler than the one her father refused to explain. Her brow slightly furrowed in concentration as she added one more line to the drawing of the race car she had started earlier. The same car she had seen in that garage, the same moment she had watched her father be taken away from without understanding why, and when she looked up at him, her eyes carried no doubt, no suspicion, just the quiet certainty that whatever had happened, her father had done the right thing, because in her world he always did. And that belief, pure and unshaken, settled into Ethan's chest like both a comfort and a responsibility too heavy to name. So when she asked, "Can you show me how it works?" holding up the drawing with uneven wheels and an oversized engine, he didn't hesitate. He pulled a chair closer, sat beside her, and took the crayon gently from her hand, not correcting her lines, but adding to them, shaping the engine with subtle precision, adjusting proportions almost unconsciously, his movements smooth and practiced like someone who didn't need to think about what he knew. And Lily leaned in closer, watching every detail, her small voice full of wonder as she said, "You make it look real." And Ethan paused for just a moment, just long enough for something unspoken to pass behind his eyes before he smiled and said, "Machines are just stories, kiddo. You just have to listen to what they're trying to say." And she nodded. Like that made perfect sense, because to her it did. Because her father had always had a way of turning the complicated into something simple, something she could understand, and they stayed like that for a while, drawing, talking, existing in a space where nothing else intruded. Not the memory of the garage, not the weight of being dismissed, not the silent judgment of a world that had already decided who Ethan was without ever asking, and later when Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, her head resting against a pillow that had long since lost its shape. Ethan carefully covered her with a thin blanket before standing there for a moment, just watching her breathe, grounding himself in the only thing that had ever mattered more than anything, He had built more than anything he had lost. And then he turned away, stepping into the small corner of the apartment he had claimed as his workspace. A cluttered table covered in old tools, scraps of metal, and pieces of machinery. Most people would have thrown away, but in Ethan's hands, they were something else. Something alive. And he picked up a small engine component, one he had salvaged weeks ago from a discarded appliance, turning it slowly under the dim light, his fingers tracing its edges like he was reading it, understanding its flaws, its imbalances, its potential. And without thinking, without effort, he reached for a screwdriver and began to adjust it. Subtle movements, precise corrections, each action guided by instinct more than conscious thought. And within minutes, the piece functioned better than it had ever been designed to smoother, quieter, more efficient. And he set it down without any sense of accomplishment, because for him, this wasn't achievement, it was simply what he did, what he had always done long before anyone had given it a title, long before anyone had recognized its value. And as he leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of the repaired component blending into the silence of the room, his mind drifted not to the humiliation of that day, not to Ava's cold dismissal, but to the sound of the engine in the garage, the subtle irregularity he had heard beneath the surface, the imbalance in the system that no one else had noticed. And he knew with the same quiet certainty that had guided his hand earlier, that the problem wasn't fully solved, that what he had fixed had only been a symptom, not the cause, and that realization lingered, not as regret, not as frustration, but as a simple fact, something he would carry without needing to act on it, because he had made his choice. He had walked away and he wasn't going back. Not for them, not for anything that place represented anymore. And across the city inside the sleek, controlled environment of Caldwell, racing, the illusion of stability was already beginning to fracture, even if no one wanted to admit it, because the engine that had roared back to life earlier that day was now showing subtle signs of instability again, fluctuations in performance that didn't match any known pattern, and the engineers, already on edge from the earlier incident, worked with increasing urgency, running diagnostics, analyzing data, searching for explanations that refused to appear. And Daniel Brooks stood among them, his earlier unease now growing into something sharper, something harder to ignore because he had been the closest to Ethan when it happened. He had seen the exact point of adjustment, the exact movement, and he knew deep down that it hadn't been random, that it hadn't been luck. And as he watched the data scroll across the screen numbers that should have aligned but didn't, he felt the first real crack in his confidence, not in his ability but in the system he had trusted, the hierarchy that told him who was allowed to know and who wasn't, and without fully deciding to. He opened the archived design files, digging into older models, older blueprints, searching for anything that might explain what he had seen. And that's when he noticed it, a small marking in the corner of a design, almost insignificant. Just 2 letters written in a way that didn't match the rest of the document, EC, and something about it made him pause, made him lean closer, because it felt familiar in a way he couldn't place, and he started cross-referencing, pulling up other designs, older ones, the most successful ones, the ones that had defined the company's reputation. And there it was, again, the same initials, consistent, precise, present in places that suggested influence far beyond what a maintenance worker could ever have. And his mind raced, connecting dots. He wasn't sure he was allowed to connect, and for the first time since joining the company, he questioned something fundamental, not just about the engine, not just about the designs, but about the story he had been told about who built this place, about who deserved credit. And as that realization began to take shape, fragile and incomplete, but impossible to ignore, Ava Caldwell stood alone in her office, staring at the same data from a different perspective, her expression as controlled as ever, but her thoughts anything but, because the numbers didn't lie. The instability was real, and despite everything, despite her authority, despite her certainty, there was one detail she couldn't erase, one moment she couldn't rewrite. The way the engine had responded to Ethan, the way it had come back to life under his touch, and she found herself replaying his words. You're solving the wrong problem over and over again, each time with a little more weight, a little more meaning until it stopped sounding like arrogance and started sounding like understanding, and that shift, subtle but undeniable, unsettled her more than any technical failure could, because it meant she might have been wrong. And being wrong wasn't something she was used to, wasn't something she allowed, so she pushed it away, focusing instead on solutions, on control, on the next steps that would keep everything from collapsing, unaware that the answer she was avoiding was already miles away. Sitting in a dimly lit apartment, quietly fixing things no one else could. Choosing silence over recognition, because for Ethan, Cole being understood had never been the goal, and for Lily, who woke briefly in the middle of the night and wandered sleepily into the workspace, rubbing her eyes as she asked, "Are you still working?" The answer didn't matter because she curled up beside him anyway, resting her head against his arm as he continued adjusting the small piece of machinery in front of him, and he glanced down at her, his movement slowing just enough to not wake her again. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of something repaired and the steady warmth of someone who believed in him without question, Ethan allowed himself the smallest exhale, the kind that came not from relief but from acceptance. Because whatever the world chose to think of him, whatever they decided he was here in this space, none of it mattered. And maybe that was enough for now. By the third day after Ethan Cole had been escorted out of Caldwell Racing, the illusion of control inside the company began to fracture in ways that no one could hide anymore. Because the engine that had briefly returned to life now behaved like something unstable, something unpredictable, its performance fluctuating without logic, its data refusing to align with any known model. And the tension in the garage shifted from confidence to quiet panic, as engineers who had once carried themselves with certainty now moved faster, spoke less, and checked their work twice, as if afraid of what they might miss again, and Ava Caldwell stood at the center of it all, her presence still commanding her voice, still sharp, but beneath that surface, something had begun to change. Something subtle and dangerous, because every time the system failed, every time the numbers contradicted the expected outcome, one memory kept resurfacing, whether she wanted it to or not. The moment a maintenance worker had stepped forward, ignored protocol, and fixed what her entire team could not, and she pushed that thought away each time it appeared, dismissing it as coincidence, as disruption, as something irrelevant to the larger picture she controlled, but the more she denied it, the stronger it returned. Like a question she couldn't answer but couldn't silence either. And across the garage floor, Daniel Brooks was no longer just uneasy. He was obsessed. Because what had started as curiosity had become a quiet investigation, one he conducted alone. Late at night, after most of the team had gone home, sitting in front of archived files that stretched back years before he had ever joined the company, and he wasn't looking for confirmation anymore. He was looking for truth. Something consistent. Something undeniable. And the deeper he went, the more the same pattern emerged. Designs that outperformed every competitor. Systems that had redefined the company's success innovations that no one could fully explain. All tied together by a small, almost invisible signature EC. And it wasn't just once or twice, it was everywhere, embedded in critical components, hidden in revisions, quietly shaping the very foundation of Caldwell Racing's reputation, and the realization hit him slowly at first, then all at once. Because there was only one person he had seen connected to those initials. Only one person who had demonstrated that level of understanding without hesitation. And the idea felt impossible, even as it made perfect sense. Because how could a man who cleaned tools and fixed broken equipment be the same person who had built the systems that defined an entire company? And yet every piece of evidence pointed in that direction. Every line of code, every design choice, every structural decision carried the same logic, the same signature, the same mind behind it. And Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, as the weight of that possibility settled in, not just as a discovery, but as a question of everything he had believed about expertise, about hierarchy, about who was allowed to matter, and he knew he couldn't keep this to himself, not anymore. So the next morning he approached Mark Reynolds with the files, his voice steady but urgent as he said, "You need to see this." And Mark barely looked up at first, dismissing it as another overreaction from a junior engineer, but when Daniel insisted. When he placed the evidence in front of him and pointed to the patterns, the signatures, the connections, something in Mark's expression shifted just slightly, just enough to reveal that he understood what was being suggested, and for a brief moment there was silence between them, the kind that comes when a truth is too inconvenient to acknowledge. And then Mark shook his head. Not because he didn't see it, but because he refused to accept it, saying, "You're reaching." Even though his tone lacked conviction, even though his eyes lingered on the initials longer than they should have, because accepting that theory would mean admitting that they had overlooked something fundamental, something right in front of them, and more importantly, it would mean admitting that the person they had dismissed, the one they had allowed to be removed without question, might have been more important than all of them combined. And that was not a conclusion Mark was willing to draw. Not yet. Not under pressure. Not when the company was already teetering on the edge of a crisis that grew worse by the hour. Because the failures were no longer isolated. They were systemic, affecting multiple prototypes, disrupting timelines, threatening contracts, and the sponsors, once patient, were now demanding answers. Their calls sharper, their expectations clearer, their tolerance fading, and Ava felt that pressure more than anyone because she understood exactly what was at stake. Not just financially, but reputationally, because Caldwell Racing wasn't just a company, it was a statement, a symbol of precision and dominance, and any sign of weakness could unravel everything she had built since taking over. So she pushed harder, demanded more, refused to entertain distractions, but even as she did, the cracks widened, the data refused to cooperate. The solutions failed to hold, and in the quiet moments between decisions when no one else was watching, she found herself returning to that same question. Not as a possibility now, but as a suspicion. She could no longer ignore who was Ethan Cole really, and why had his presence in that garage felt less like an intrusion and more like something that had always belonged there. And that thought unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain because it challenged something deeper than her authority. It challenged her understanding of control itself. And for someone like Ava, control was everything. It was the foundation of every decision, every success, every identity she had built. So she resisted. She held on to the version of reality that made sense. The one where Ethan was just a maintenance worker who had overstepped, the one where his action was a violation, not a solution. But the evidence around her refused to support that version anymore. And as Daniel continued his investigation, as more patterns emerged, as more engineers began to quietly question what they thought they knew, the tension inside Caldwell Racing shifted from external pressure to internal doubt. The most dangerous kind because it didn't just threaten outcomes, it threatened belief. And once belief started to crack, everything else followed, and far from the chaos in the quiet of his small apartment, Ethan remained unchanged, his routine steady, his focus inward, as if none of it concerned him. As if the storm building around his absence had nothing to do with him at all, and yet the signs were there, subtle but unmistakable. The way he paused when certain sounds came through the television, the way his eyes narrowed slightly when a race clip played, the way his hands unconsciously mirrored adjustments in the air, as if correcting something only he could see. And Lily noticed those moments not with suspicion, but with curiosity, because to her, they were just part of who her father was, part of the quiet mystery that made him different. And one evening, as she sat beside him watching a race replay, she tilted her head and asked, "Why do they keep doing it like that, pointing to a maneuver on the screen?" And Ethan hesitated for just a second before answering, his voice calm, almost distant, as he said, "Because they think it's the best way." And Lily frowned slightly, considering that before asking, "Is it?" And that question hung in the air longer than it should have, because it wasn't just about the race, it was about everything, about assumptions, about decisions. About the gap between what people believed and what was true. And Ethan looked at the screen, at the familiar design, the familiar flaw hidden beneath layers of complexity, and he simply said, "Not always." And Lily nodded, satisfied with the answer because she didn't need more. She trusted that if there was something to understand, her father would know it, and that trust, quiet and unwavering. stood in stark contrast to the growing doubt inside Caldwell Racing, where the truth was getting closer with every passing hour, even as those in power tried to push it away, because the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the initials EC were not just marks on old designs. They were a signature, a legacy, a presence that had shaped everything they were now struggling to maintain. And the question was no longer whether Ethan Cole knew more than he appeared. The question was how much more and what it would mean if they had just thrown away the one person who understood the system better than anyone else. And as that realization loomed heavy and unavoidable, Ava Caldwell stood at the edge of a decision she had never imagined she would have to make. One that would force her to confront not just a mistake, but the possibility that the very foundation of her authority had been built on something she never truly understood. And for the first time since taking control of the company, she felt something unfamiliar, something she couldn't command or dismiss, something that grew stronger. The longer she ignored it, doubt. The call came just before sunrise when the city was still quiet, and the world hadn't yet decided what it would become that day. And Ethan Cole stared at the phone longer than he should have before answering, because he already knew who it was, not by the number, but by the weight of everything that had been left unresolved. And when Ava Caldwell's voice came through, it was different from the one he remembered, stripped of its sharp edges, carrying something unfamiliar beneath the control, something close to humility. As she said, "We need you." And for a moment Ethan said nothing, his eyes drifting toward the small couch where Lily still slept, her steady breathing grounding him in a way nothing else could, and he could have refused. He could have reminded Ava exactly how easily she had dismissed him, how quickly she had chosen authority over understanding. But instead he asked a simpler question, one that mattered more than anything else. What's wrong? And the answer came without hesitation, this time without pride or deflection, everything. And that was enough because despite everything that had happened, despite the humiliation and the silence that followed, Ethan had never been the kind of man who walked away from something broken if he knew how to fix it. So hours later, he stepped back into Caldwell Racing, not as a maintenance worker, not as someone invisible, but as someone who no longer needed permission to exist in that space. And the shift was immediate. Felt in the way conversations stopped when he entered, in the way eyes followed him, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition. And Ava stood waiting near the center of the garage, her posture still composed, but her expression stripped of the certainty that had once defined her, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke. Because everything that needed to be said existed in the space between them, until she finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but steady as she said, "I was wrong." And those 3 words, simple and direct, carried more weight than any command she had ever given, because they weren't just an apology, they were an admission, a shift, a recognition of something she had failed to see. And Ethan nodded once, not in acceptance of the apology, but in acknowledgement of the truth behind it, before turning his attention to the car, because that was why he was there, not for validation, not for redemption, but for the work itself. And as he moved around the engine, inspecting it with the same quiet focus as before, the entire garage seemed to hold its breath, watching as he traced the system not just with his hands, but with an understanding that went deeper than any blueprint, deeper than any data set. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried no hesitation, no doubt. "You didn't just change the balance ratio," he said, glancing briefly at Ava. "You changed the foundation." And the words landed heavily because they weren't just about the engine. They were about everything, about decisions made without full understanding about systems, altered without knowing why they worked in the first place. And one of the engineers, unable to hold back any longer, stepped forward and asked, "How do you know all this?" And for the first time, Ethan didn't avoid the answer, didn't deflect or remain silent. He simply said, "Because I built it." And the garage fell into complete silence, the kind that follows a truth too large to process all at once. Because in that moment, everything shifted. Every assumption, every hierarchy, Every judgment that had been made about him unraveled completely. And Ava closed her eyes briefly as the full weight of that realization settled in. Not just that she had fired the wrong man, but that she had dismissed the very person who had created the system she now depended on. And when she opened them again, there was no trace of the authority she had once used to shield herself. Only clarity as she stepped closer and said, "I can't undo what I did, but I can choose what happens next." And Ethan studied her for a moment, not with anger, not with resentment, but with the quiet evaluation of someone who had long ago learned that people reveal who they are not in their mistakes, but in what they do after them. And then he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding, before turning back to the engine and beginning to work his movements precise, deliberate, restoring balance, not just to the machine, but to the room itself. And when the engine finally came back to life, not just running, but perfect in a way it hadn't been before, the tension that had gripped the company for days released all at once, replaced by something quieter, something steadier. Respect. And later, as the team gathered for the test run, as the car moved across the track with a smoothness that spoke of something deeper than technical success. Lily stood beside Ava at the viewing window, her small hand pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with pride as she whispered, "That's my dad." And Ava glanced down at her, then back at Ethan, who stood far from the spotlight watching without seeking recognition. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't before, that leadership wasn't about control, it was about seeing clearly. About knowing the value of the people around you before it was too late. And as the car crossed the finish line flawlessly, Ava stepped forward and addressed the team. Her voice steady but changed as she said, "From now on, we don't measure people by their titles and across the garage." Ethan met her gaze for just a second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, not of power, but of respect. And when he finally turned to leave, Lily running to his side and slipping her hand into his. There was no applause, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet understanding that something important had shifted, something that wouldn't be undone. Because sometimes the loudest victories aren't the ones the world sees, but the ones that restore what was almost lost. And as they walked out together, the hum of the engine fading behind them, the truth remained simple and undeniable, that the man they had once dismissed had been the one holding everything together all along, and in choosing to forgive instead of proving them wrong. Ethan Cole had rebuilt more than just a machine, he had rebuilt the way they saw,